Hello and good evening, and welcome to this History of Psychiatry Special Interest Group webinar. I'm Adrian James, I'm the President of the College, and I'm delighted to be with you this evening, and thank you so much for joining. Now, we've all lived through absolutely unprecedented times, and the History of Psychiatry Special Interest Group had the great idea of trying to record some living history of mental health, mental illness, and the pandemic. So they decided to get some personal reflections on the pandemic as it happened, and hence the Future Archive competition. So when people ask, what was mental health care like in 2020 and 2021, the college has an archive charting how mental health care is delivered and experienced today. And this competition was part of that. So the college was founded in 1841, and we're celebrating our 180th anniversary in 2021. And we've run a series of webinars. I hope that you've seen those that have been broadcast so far, charting some of the real historic moments, but actually looking back so that we can learn for the future. And the Future Archives competition is part of our 180th anniversary celebrations. So the competition closed on the 30th of April 2021, and we received 60 entries asking for personal reflections on the pandemic from a mental health perspective. And we had amazing entries. I read each and every one of them. The entries were in a variety of formats, so essays, poems, stories, films, paintings, and cartoon strips. And they came from clinicians, from patients, and from the public. And they were assessed by an expert panel of judges, journalists, clinicians, patients, historians. And so it was a real privilege to read those. And we'll actually be keeping all of those in the college archive. But we had 4 winners, 3 medical practitioners, Karish, Rachel, and Jennifer, who are with us this evening. We're going to be hearing from them, and they're going to be tell us about their entry and actually reading it, and also from one patient, Aliyah, who couldn't actually make it today, but the renowned author and psychiatrist Joanna Cannon will actually be reading on their behalf. So thank you so much, Joanna, for that. So the entries have received a certificate of participation, and the winning entries received an iPad, which is, I think, a great prize. But I think the really great prize with this is the participation and the historical record. So I'm now going to introduce our winners, and they're going to present their work, maybe say a little bit about them. I'll leave them to tell you who they are. And so our first winner is Karish Devan, and Karish is going to present on the masks we wear. So over to you, Karish.
Thank you, Adrian. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name's Karish. I'm a CT3 as of last week, working in the Maudsley. So the piece that I entered captured a day in my life during this sort of quite difficult period where COVID was sort of raging on, and my mum had been admitted to a hospice. So the piece is called "The Masks That We Wear." My mother died unexpectedly in January 2021. It was almost a year after scientists had published the first cases of an unknown pneumonia detected in the city of Wuhan, caused by a virus that would come to be known as COVID-19. For this entry into the archive, I wanted to record a typical day for me in this period. By daylight, I was working as a core psychiatry trainee in liaison psychiatry, and then in the evening, I would visit my mother in her hospice, whilst looming over us all was a perpetual and even more restrictive lockdown. 18th of January. The number of security outside the hospital ebbs and flows with the daily infection rate. When the number is high, like today, there is a wall of guards in neon jackets, and their eyes fall like lasers upon everyone trying to enter the building. Staff are only let through after breathtakingly close inspections of their badges, whereas bewildered patients must offer their clinic letters to the burly men like holy relics. I join the long socially distanced queue and wait my turn to be inspected. Once inside the hospital, I join torrents of people following the new one-way system. Despite the staircases to the liaison offices being tantalizingly visible, the entrance has been sealed off to ensure no one can bypass due to these latest COVID measures. So I have to walk the long way around. Mask count, 1. Finally, at my office, I changed my mask from a reusable fabric one to a powder blue surgical mask. Although I've trimmed my beard so it will fit, these masks still leave pinch points on my nose and cheekbones at the end of the day. My first assessment is an A&E, newly divided into translucent cubicles by thick sheets of plastic. Then to the surgical ward, where an agitated COVID patient is refusing to isolate in his room. With some reassurance, largely by the ward matron, the patient calms down and is further settled by a tablet of lorazepam. Mask count, 3. Paperwork fills the rest of my morning. One of my fellow trainees comes to my desk and invites me to lunch. I haven't yet told my whole team about my mum, so when he asks what I've got planned for this evening, I find myself lying. It feels easier to say the usual, watching TV till my eyeballs melt like everybody else in lockdown, than to tell him the truth, visiting my dying mother. We eat in one of the new wellness centres that was created at the start of the pandemic in the hospital, a boardroom that is now covered in mindfulness posters and at the beginning of the pandemic was overladen with free groceries and hot meals. That well of generosity has dried up now, and all that is left is an increasingly tired staff and just a bowl of anemic apples. My pager goes off, so I leave. Mask count, 7. Finishing my notes on time, I race out of hospital. The bin by the exit is overflowing with discarded face masks, one of which is picked up by the wind as I open the door. It flies out into the darkening streets of London. I head to the station to catch the train to the hospice. The carriage, in fact the entire train, is empty as it slowly rumbles out of the station. Mask count, 8. My dad calls me when I reach the hospice. He's already visited earlier in the day, and between him and my brother, we have to perform what he calls the dance of the 2 guests. Due to the regulations, only 2 visitors maximum a day can visit a patient in a hospice. Of all the new rules, this one feels the most arbitrary and the most unnecessarily cruel. Mask count, 9. Mum looks like she's sleeping in the hospital bed, but she does not stir when I enter her room. Then I notice her breathing, growing wetter and louder each day. I know from my medical training and the faces of the hospice staff that her death will come soon. I hold her hand briefly, but she can no longer hold me back. Instead, I start to talk to her, something I felt so embarrassed doing when she first was admitted, but now comes so easily. No news, I tell her. Pandemic is still going strong. Suddenly, I notice her arms twitch slightly. I'm filled with an instant horror before she starts moving in a more aggressive manner, shaking her arms and her legs. Before I can even press the buzzer, a nurse has come in. We call this agitation, the nurse says, as she goes to open the medication cabinet. She produces a small ampule of clear liquid. This is lorazepam. It will help, she says, before calmly drawing it up. I can't remember the last time I cried, but then my eyes start to burn in a way that feels so familiar, almost adolescent. I get up to leave. I haven't told the hospice staff that I'm a doctor. It doesn't seem relevant. But I feel that some almost professional conflict at the thought of crying around them. In the courtyard of the hospice, I feel the fabric of my mask grow heavy with tears. It grows more sodden. Fibers start to fray. I feel them bristling and spiking in my cheek. I take it off, breathing in the cold evening air. A nurse comes out to find me, placing her hand on my elbow in a gesture that is unfathomable in its kindness. I realize that it's the first time I've been touched all day. Soon I will have to leave to get the last train home, but also to give myself some time before work tomorrow to put all of my masks back on. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for that, Karish. That was incredibly moving and deeply personal. So thank you for your generosity in sharing that with us. And I have to say I was deeply moved by hearing that. It was very, very emotional and really very emotional to the absolute core. So thank you for that. Just a reminder to all of you, if you have a question, you can post the question in the Q&A. We'll try to have some time at the end to ask our presenters. So please store up your questions, and we'll move to our next presenter, Jennifer Parker. And Jennifer, you're going to say a little bit about yourself and your entry and your reflections on that, and read that. And you're going to present on the underbelly of a pandemic. Over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Jenny Parker, and I'm a higher trainee in old age and general adult psychiatry in the Severn Deanery. And over the last year, I've been working in prison psychiatry, and I was left quite sort of struck and dumbfounded really by what I saw, because it felt like the few rights which prisoners had were being rapidly eroded because of or under the kind of term of COVID. So I thought that this competition offered a really lovely opportunity to try and share some of the stories of the patients that I met to a wider audience, and to kind of force these narratives into the history of the pandemic. So I'm going to read now my poem, which is titled The Underbelly of a Pandemic. I didn't know our world was set to change, when slowly, before all at once, a great sad weight of human suffering descended, and with the virus, I watched sorrow disseminate. I was left to oscillate between states of numb ennui, glum despair, and hope. Potential victim, vector, and victor, the threat now visible without a microscope. As a doctor, I still left home, returning initially to the sound of my neighbourhood's applause. I've had the opportunity to provide psychiatric care to prisoners, many ensnared in a world of archaic laws. In the prisons, I have borne witness to a teeming mass of life locked away in cramped Victorian cells for 23 hours of every single day. Within these cells, calorie-controlled meals congeal beside blocked toilets and spike the air, torrid too, with cramped bodies and minds left to go threadbare. Lives compounded with hurt are left to stew in the dark, whilst rehabilitation takes a backseat. Truly, the situation for many is overwhelmingly stark. Psychological groups deemed too risky, replaced instead with well-being leaflets pressed under the door. Psychiatric visits can only be offered to the most floridly psychotic or severely depressed. Self-harm rates overwhelm the system. Drugs abound. Sadness fills the empty communal spaces. Already dwindling connections to the outside world dissolve. And all the while, we can barely offer the basics. Hospital transfers are modern nativity reenactments. Nationally, we're told there are no beds. The line in the sand between what is mentally unwell enough redrawn over our heads. The discourse that the virus imprisoned us all cannot imagine what has happened for those spectral figures behind bars whose disconsolateness grows. If I had not seen the state of these people myself, their stories would have belied belief. One of the many privileges of prison psychiatry is how it throws the comforts of my own life into extremely stark relief. Thank you.
Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for that, again, very moving account. And I think we've all suffered with the pandemic, but there are clearly some groups who, because of their situation, have suffered more than anyone. And I think I've been very much aware of the struggles within prisons, and so thank you for shining a light on that and drawing that to people's attention, and all that you've actually done as well through your work. So thank you so much. So don't forget to put those questions in the Q&A, and we'll move on to our next entry. And this is Dr. Rachel Sullivan, and Dr. Sullivan is going to talk about what was psychiatry like in 2020-21. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm actually happy to leave the slides until the end, if that's okay, to my tech supporters. I'm going to do things a little bit the other way round. So I'm a general adult psychiatrist, and I really appreciated the whole concept of the Future Archives and the competition itself, which gave me this great opportunity to write something down. So I'll begin with what I wrote, and then at the end, I might show you some images that explain what I wrote and a little bit more about myself. What was psychiatry like in 2020 to 2021? Well, psychiatry in 2020 to 2021 was just like psychiatry in 2019 to 2020, except with more hand washing and more masks and fear. There was definitely more fear. It was especially on the faces of the staff and some, but not all of the patients. Those who were convinced it was a conspiracy and not really happening were less fearful, in the beginning anyway. And the windows were open more, so it was colder. Chairs were spaced out and the smell of alcohol was in the air. Not the nice kind of alcohol that might be in a tumbler with an ice cube or a slice of lemon, but the harsh kind from packets and buckets of wipes. That was for wiping down the chairs and the desks, and of course the Perspex screens that appeared next on the desks. And there was so much more plastic and goggles and the tracks of goggle elastic on the hot, sweaty faces of those that had to wear them. Then there was the rustling of plastic aprons, more plastic, and the sound of psychiatrists swearing as they struggled into the unfamiliar gowns. The nurses were better at that. And there was the swabbing. That was new. There was a whole new category of clinician, the swabber. Every ward wanted one of those. There were a lot more thermometers, with a flurry of beeps twice a day as everyone checked their temperature at the start and at the end of whatever their shift was. And there was no shifting. Well, no affection anyway. No hugging, with new yellow stickers on the floor to remind everyone of what 2 meters looks like. No long chats either. 15 minutes and not in person unless really necessary. No visitors. Well, only if they were screen-sized and flat. No leave to go to the shops or for coffee in town. A cigarette run twice a day was negotiated to stop withdrawals and potential war. There was a sudden increase in technology. Imagine, you could make a barrister, a psychiatrist, and a layperson work far, far away at the end of a telephone. There was remote working for the community teams and remote assessments and treatments for those who were ill but could manage as an outpatient. Sometimes there were still visits from the home treatment teams, but there was a COVID questionnaire first, and new protocols, and temperature checks, and lots of hand washing, and more masks, always lots of those. And there was illness, and there was death. There was a sense of thank God not us when a new outbreak was announced without our name attached. There was the sound of a temporary morgue being built one evening and a sick feeling in the stomachs of those who heard the hammering and knew what it meant. There was no wake or big funeral for the consultant who died, and colleagues ran out for a minute to stand in the rain as the hearse passed, 2 meters and masks, always 2 meters and masks. And there were new showers built outside and new scrubs, and some were even quite jaunty. But there were still some older patients who desperately wanted to shake your hand or go outside, and who wore their mask upside down and broke your heart. And you worried for those who'd come in from normal world, but would go out to definitely not normal world and who would struggle to adjust. And staff and patients and families did adjust to the online prescription and the telecall and the video assessment and the no visiting. And upstairs there was hand clapping and free pizza and hampers and ice cream sometimes. And sometimes they would remember us downstairs in the basement, sorry, lower ground, and send us some sandwiches. But there was still psychosis and depression and suicidal thoughts. And there was still medication, but no ECT. The theatres and anaesthetists were for the physically ill. In fact, they came and looked at our ward and wondered if the oxygen points worked and could we become a medical ward? And we wondered, where would we go? And psychiatrists and the trainees tried online learning and found it worked for some things, but not for everything. And we learned about viruses and transmission and infection control. And then we learned about COVID and psychosis and COVID and depression. And suddenly there was long COVID. But we kept going and hoped for a vaccine and normal. And we worried when our patients were not prioritized. And we hoped our community colleagues would miss something on the phone line or through the screen. But the admissions kept coming, and the words lonely and isolation aren't in DSM or ICD, but they were common diagnoses. And we kept those windows open and those masks on, and we asked for better broadband and put single rooms and a garden on our wish list at the business meeting. And the day hospital stayed closed, and the community CBT groups didn't happen, and people were still anxious and obsessional and thinking negatively. And technology and paranoid delusions don't always work well together. So when the vaccination program was announced, things felt a little lighter. And the day it started, there was a party atmosphere. We had cake with 4 o'clock tea. And the vaccinated staff and patients watched a horse race together and cheered. And it felt like the sun was shining for a few minutes. But we remembered those who had lost the race too. So in 2021, there is still depression and psychosis and anxiety, and patients who want to be admitted and those who don't. And now there is long COVID too. But there is recognition and vaccination and new learning. So there is hope and recovery, and looking forward to 2022. And although still with hand washing and masks, there is less fear. There is definitely less fear. So I thought it might help if I have time, and please stop me if I go on too long, if I could show a few slides with some images that might explain a little bit about my perspective. And thank you so much to Emma and Charlotte for helping me with these. So if you want to move ahead to the first image, which is the next slide. Thank you. So the reason when I saw the special interest group had this project going on, you can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So thank you. So no, that one was fine. The diaries. Yeah. The reason I was so pleased that there was a chance to write something down is that I've been keeping a diary since I was very, very small, in early single figures. So my house is full of records of things that were. In fact, some would say my writing is better now than it was, or is worse now than it was then. And when I have time, and very occasionally to look back, I am struck by how little I write about the facts of what has happened, so the history or the historical thing that happened. And the biggest piece is what I felt or how it affected the people near to me. And it struck me that when you read history books, mostly you simply get the facts, not the personal. And history is factual, but it's also personal. And I thought what was great about this, and by the way, I read and cried buckets reading some of the other prize winners and those shortlisted, because I think the same themes keep coming up, but people have different perspectives, and that's so important. So in the next slide, I'll tell you my perspective. Thank you. So my perspective is a general adult psychiatrist, a very old one, which is why my biography gets longer and longer. But I work in a general hospital providing acute psychiatric services to any general adult needing admission in the county of Cavan that's shown there on that map, and the neighbouring county Monaghan, where I worked previously for 15 years. And just to say, that's quite a unique perspective. It is a borderland region, and I think it very much coloured some of what I wrote and why I wrote it. So writing down events that happens has always been important for me. So if I could see the next slide, please, thank you. So it's where you are geographically, I think probably affects what you write. And I heard, I think Jennifer say about where you are as well, and the situation you find yourself makes such a difference to the impact of something like a pandemic. This book, the title some people might find offensive, and I don't know if any in the special interest group are familiar with it. This is The Psychology of Insanity by Bernard Hart. But I found it by accident some time ago, and I keep it on my desk because his insights are interesting. But one thing he said several times that's important is that I'm writing this now because this is what we think and this is our experience now. But it will look different in the future, and we'll see things differently in the future when our knowledge changes. So I thought that was a very important piece underlying what I was writing. I think all the time it was, we're here now, but there is going to be, I hope, a future. Next slide. And again, I think when we talk about perspectives, probably other people listening live in border regions, but this has been a particularly sensitive border region through my growing up. I grew up in what was a war zone, but I didn't realize it at the time. It was my normality. And it's fantastically changed in recent years. But those of us who are familiar with the bad years or the very difficult years are sometimes amazed that those coming after us, luckily, haven't experienced the same awfulness. But in a way, they need to know some of it so that they can learn from it. And I think that's the importance of recording, as I said, the personal. Otherwise, it's hard to understand for people who didn't experience the tough times. It's hard for those who didn't to understand why we sometimes think or act as we do. And by the way, just to say, COVID completely ignored the border. It didn't really care. But there were lots of divisions that I noticed, and I think it's been alluded to, that depending on what area of psychiatry you're working in, you could really see the people who suffered more because of the pandemic. Next slide, thank you. So my neck of the woods, as you can see, most people have never heard of Cavan unless you're Irish. It's full of hills and lakes. It's a very green, very biodiverse county. And I think a few of us have mentioned the masks and all that plastic and all the extra waste that was being generated during the pandemic, and necessary and all as it was, it really, really troubled me because I could just think of the impact it was going to have on this lovely region. And in the next slide, the fact of there being many hills might not be instantly apparent, but it links to my reference of basement and lower ground. This is Cavan General Hospital where I work. Not the prettiest of buildings, no disrespect to the architects, but when you go in from the front, because it's built into a hill, most places in Cavan are because it's very hilly, it does feel like you're going to the basement when you're going to the psychiatric unit. And when you come in from the back, because it's built into a hill, it's a little bit more positive and it feels like lower ground and is a little brighter. Can I say that, and I don't know what other people might think, but to be a psychiatrist, but in a general hospital, which at one stage was completely overwhelmed with COVID, was a very, very difficult place to be. And at times we were very isolated, and our patients were asked to not go to the ED and to find a kind of a parallel casualty. And I know from other people's experience that was similar, and it was really, really difficult. So in the next slide, we didn't benefit from the ice cream. It never trickled as far down as us, but we made our own cake. So that's a very small looking, actually pathetic chocolate cake, but I bake for my team every Tuesday for our multidisciplinary meeting. If nothing else, it encourages people to come and find out what I've made. And we kept our morale going that way. But as you can see, we're still with masks and we're still with distancing. And trust me, the window is open and there's a strong smell of the not nice alcohol in the air at that meeting. So next slide, please. So as I say, cake does make a difference. Little things made a huge difference. And I think we certainly learned that during this pandemic, and it featured in what I wrote. Cake, and our patients got chances to bake in a socially distanced way as well, if they found that helpful. And the horse race I mentioned, that day was probably the very first time I heard people laughing and saw people smiling behind their masks for a very long time. So it was a really good moment. And I mentioned, if you could put up the next slide, thank you. I mentioned that those that had lost the race. The consultant who died wasn't a psychiatrist. Paul was a general a general physician in the hospital upstairs. He had been ill for a while, but he was an absolute gentleman. And he had been incredibly kind to my own father, who sadly found himself terminally ill at 59. And he was so good to him. And then he incredibly bravely took on my mother's blood pressure, which is a very, very scary thing. In fact, she still says to doctors new to her, you may need to sit down when you're taking this. I find they get frightened. So he was really good and managed her. And it's a testament to him that she is still with us. So it was incredibly sad that somebody who'd given so much slipped away. And the Irish do death well. I'm sure many other cultures do, but gosh, it's a big thing with us. And the 3-day wake is so carved into our mentality that for his family not to have that opportunity was unbearably sad. And the only ironic thing is it rained so hard the day his hearse was passing. And we consider that to be quite a lucky thing for it to rain heavily on the day of your funeral, which is a small consolation. So this is my final slide, really, or second last slide. If you just move it on, thank you. This is my favorite bin. I love this bin. This bin, and I think somebody else mentioned masks and bins. This bin is the bin that when things were really bad, and I genuinely was scared that I would go into the hospital one day and have a temperature and not be able to go home, or bring COVID to somebody that I cared about. It was such a relief every day to come out and put my mask into that bin. And I never thought I would hear myself say that I love a bin, but I do. And I still, even though I reference the fear being less, and it is less, I don't feel as scared now as I used to. It still is that lovely moment in the day when I'm passing that bin and I put my mask in and I feel myself getting taller and breathing more. So as I said, my final slide is this one, the next one, sorry. The thanks again to the college, the special interest group, the judges for liking what I wrote. For anybody who's listening now, I really think it was a wonderful opportunity, and thank you so much. This very last image is, if you ever are visiting the region that I'm in, it's a place called Cuilcagh Mountain, which is Bin Cuilcagh in Irish, which is a chalky peak, and it's a beautiful place to go. When you're up there, everything looks amazing. From up there, the whole world looks truly good. In fact, it's known as the Stairway to Heaven because they put a boardwalk in and steps to try and limit damage to the mountain from walkers. And the reason I think of it at a time like this is that geographically, we've all had different experiences of the pandemic for ourselves and for our patients. And in the future, I hope we'll be like at Cuilcagh, looking down on it or looking at it from a distance, and it won't look so bad. But we need to remember the things we learned during it and what it has demonstrated and what it has turned up, so that we can, I suppose, manage things in the future and be kind to each other. Because for some people, this would have been an inconvenient time when they couldn't go for a drink, and for other people, it has caused their death or the death of somebody belonging to them, or has irreparably damaged their lives. So I think we need to remember that as the time and distance moves on. And the reason I picked that spot is it's not the highest peak in Ireland. There's about 169, I think, higher, but it's the only peak that has the border running through it. So it's the only peak that is shared by both the north and the south. So at one stage, it might have looked beautiful from up there, but whichever side you descended into was troubled. Now, thankfully, things are much better. But I think the importance of perspective and including everybody's perspective is so important. So my congratulations again. Thank you to the Special Interest Group for this opportunity. Thank you.
Well, Rachel, thanks so much for that really visceral reminder of everything to do with the pandemic, the plastic, the swabbing, the gowns, the masks, but also reminding us of the terrible loss for some people. And I often reflect that when people are talking about the pandemic is easing, that we can go back to some of our experiences, there are many people whose lives will be forever affected by the pandemic in a way that can't be mended. And you've reminded us of that severe loss, but also the hope that you've given us as well. Those lovely pictures, looks absolutely beautiful there. So thank you. And I had that same experience with the bin, actually. There's a bin as I leave. I'm a forensic psychiatrist. I work in a secure unit. And there's the bin where you put your mask at the end of the day, finally wash your hands. I walk out of the unit into the open, and I feel I've got through another day. So I have exactly the same experience. Who would have thought? So thank you so much, Rachel. That was really such a lovely contribution. So we'll come back to questions later. Don't forget to put your questions in the Q&A. And we're going to move on to our final entry, and this is Alea's. And Alea unfortunately can't be with us today. And Alea describes herself as a Londoner of 5 generations of river people. Dockers, bargees, sail and rope makers, the essence of the water, London past, present and future. And I'm going to leave it to Joanna Cannon, who needs really no introduction, to read their entry. Joanna is such an amazing person. We're so proud of everything that you've done, Joanna, a Sunday Times best-selling author, particularly people will know the trouble with goats and sheep, and just a fantastic contribution to literature and to psychiatry. So I'm going to leave it to you, Joanna, to be here on behalf of Alea. Over to you.
Lovely, thank you. It was a huge privilege to be a judge on this competition, and I found it really moving to read especially the patient stories. And it really inspired me to go to my publisher and say, to HarperCollins, and say, is there any way that we can get these stories a wider audience? Can we make a book out of the patient's stories? Can they tell their own stories for us? And HarperCollins agreed with me. So from this competition, there will be a book, and we're looking to commission 12 patients to tell their stories, inspired by the words that I read when I was a judge. And one of those entries, of course, was Alea's entry, and it's a huge privilege to read it today. I was not a writer, nor a poet, nor a musician, nor an artist. I speak my voices. I dictate the words spoken to me and the thoughts stolen from me. The voices I hear are my guides. They are the spirits of my ancestors. They are all around me. They are not my demons and do not need to be medicalized or silenced. The voices I hear are my terrors. They battle with my ancestors. I throw a blanket over them to quieten. I have no place in the mental health system, for it terrifies me. The violence is everywhere. The energy conspires with my terrors, so I must shut down to protect, or immerse myself in the healing waters of the Thames. You can't catch fire in the river where the spirits live. February 2020. It is Tet, and I'm in Hue, Vietnam, to pay last respects to those who guided me throughout my life, to be cared for and nourished in the spiritual community that heals me, that supports me to invite my voices in for tea, where mindfulness is an ethical way of being and not a tool to silence. I have freedom. I am sent by those who love me, and because there is no healing in the NHS in mental health. For I am the disengaged, and they are the hard to reach. But there is threat, there is fear, there is violence, so I am escaped and immune. And I am now back in the UK and told I am too contaminated to be allowed out my home. The government says so. But where terrors are lying within the walls and wires and tentacles in blood trying to strangle me, because the world I now have to come back to is shut down and is only there in apps and Zoom, A to Z, 24 letters in between, and words jump out with signs. There are people on the telly building castles out of sourdough and singing on multiple split screens, badly, very badly. I wear headphones all the time. I wear 2 headphones all the time. Police come, again, violence of welfare checks, because I have no access to real time. The world is now remote. My flesh and blood are not allowed to touch me because I am contaminated. They wear masks to disguise themselves. Terror voices tell me why. I must hide. Remote working, but no one is at work. My front door is smashed in the name of welfare, so strangers move in to protect me, they say. I barricade myself in my bedroom and pay them to leave. Everything in my physical body is hurting, but there are no body doctors anymore. Like the mind doctors, they are hiding behind masks and Wi-Fi, the new barriers. I have no phone, I have no Wi-Fi, I have no food. I have multiple layers, YouTube videos playing in my head, eyes open, eyes shut, Stop sleeping because it is dangerous to let my guard down. Food boxes with war rations come from the government. Corned beef and Fray Bentos, sentient beings. I know they're poisoned. I need the sangha, but it is zoomed. I need the cafe, but it is closed. I need my green space, but strangers are exercising in it. Star jumps, bike riding and dogs, so many dogs. And the police keep coming and drag me to the detention of the ED, where faceless assassins await to re-traumatize, because that is the point. What point? And each time I am turned into the night, shoeless and cold. I was so cold. My home is no longer safe. I go seek my ancestors at night, always at night. The tide is so low I can smell the salt in the air. And in the water I feel free and safe, so safe. My other safe place of rebaptism, I write on my arm, do not speak if asked. I have 22 Sharpies. 2020 equals chasms. Hundreds of good deeds on BBC Breakfast. Kindness, random acts of kindness. Walking people and crying people behind glass windows. I know because one of them was mine. The haves and the have-nots. Acceptable, anxiety and stress. Not acceptable, command hallucinations and profit paths. Chasms in services, telephone only or die. I am too contaminated for the ED, which confirms terror voices of violent ends. So no telephone, I must die. The writing is on the wall, literally. I miss human touch. I miss random conversations at 2 a.m. on the South Bank. I miss the haves and the have-nots. Those who Zoom and those who can't. Those who phone and those who can't. No matter how many times police drag me in 2020, there is no mental health contact after. And I'm grateful that they closed up shop to the severe endurings, for they have shut down to all but the worried well. That was my 2020. Alea. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Joanna, for reminding us, first of all, of the importance of listening to patients, listening to their stories through their voice, and thank you for what amazing reading. I'm sure that Alea would have been really proud to have had you read their account, and again, deeply moving and emotional. So thank you so much for that. I mean, we're going to go on to some questions now, and also fantastic news about HarperCollins. I mean, is there anything else you wanted to say about that? That was your idea and putting it to them, and obviously you've got huge influence, but what an amazing project. Do you want to just say a little bit more about that before we go on to general questions?
I'm so thrilled they're going to go ahead with it. One of the entries, and I don't know if the entrant is out there, but it was titled, "Will you read this, please?" And it was patient writing. I don't know if you remember it. And it reminded me every time I used to walk on the wards, the patient would come up to me with a piece of paper and say, will you read this, please? And they'd written down their thoughts and emotions, because I think sometimes they felt they were more likely to be heard if it was on paper. And I thought there must be some way of putting these voices on a bigger stage, but maybe those voices aren't confident enough to tell the story themselves. So I had the idea of pairing each patient with a best-selling author and having a collaboration. And of course, they would be paid in the same way the author would be paid, and having the story told on their terms, but the author acting as kind of conduit to help them tell their story. And HarperCollins loved the idea. And I had so many, I don't name names, but I've had so many amazing authors offer their services to help a patient tell a story. So if there's anybody out there who knows a patient whose story would be a good one for the public kind of more at large to read, to help them understand, please get in touch with us, because we're looking for some good stories to tell, and I'm sure there are lots out there, but I'm absolutely thrilled they're going to go ahead with it.
Well, that's really fantastic news, and I know that wouldn't have happened without your contribution to that. So, Joanna, thank you so much for that, and we really look forward to seeing the end product. Lots of fantastic comments in the chat. People saying how moving the poems, the readings were, the reflections, obviously, for people, reminding them of their own experience, and a big thank you to all the contributors. So thank you so much for that. I really just wanted to ask each of you, when you reflect on the pandemic, and we're not out of it yet, what do you think has been the biggest learning for you personally, but also in relation to mental health services more generally? I should say Karish has had to leave. This is again the reality of working in medicine. Karish is the only doctor on their unit, and so Karish has had to go, so sends his apologies. So not part of the Q&A. But Rachel, I don't know if we could start with you on your reflections on the lessons for you and for services more generally.
Well, I suppose some of it, I hope you can hear me. Is that okay? Yeah.
We can, yeah.
That's good. Just when you mentioned about Karish as well, I mean, there were times when I was literally the only psychiatrist physically across the two counties who was in, because I was in the acute unit. So other people attempted to work remotely. One of the things I was impressed by was how quickly we could change things when we had to. That, I don't know if it's the same in all jurisdictions, but sometimes you try to make change and it's just so slow and it's so gradual, and particularly if there's legislation or if there's something to do with the health service executive, it can take a long time going through so many stages. And it was amazing how, when the pandemic really hit, how things could be swept away. And that was my reference to the barrister and everybody being remote, and suddenly mental health tribunals were so strict, they had to be run in such a way, and suddenly the legislation could come in just like that. And that was a good lesson to learn. So when you really have to, you can change things. And I'd like to think that we wouldn't go back into the old rut, that it would be a little bit easier when we can clearly identify something that needs to change, that we can remember the lesson of the pandemic, that it was possible then, so it should always be possible. And when I heard Jennifer and that, I think maybe everywhere has that issue where patients are in the criminal justice system and there's no easy way out for them, and treatment in that setting can be so difficult. And I suppose you'd like to think, well, okay, we could change things very quickly when we needed to. Can we move things along a bit faster as a result? So I can't help. I try and be optimistic always. It's been a terrible time for so many people, and I hope that everybody will be sensitive to the different experiences people had, because like I say, for some people it was an annoyance, and for other people it was life-ending. So I hope that the other big lesson is, first, that if we need to change things, we could. Therefore, can we always have a little bit of that? And the second is that we have to stay kind to each other and tolerant of the fact that different people will have experienced it differently. And I don't know if that helps. And back to what I said, I'm always struck when I look back at things I've written years ago, that the facts are easy enough recorded. The statistics are easily enough recorded. It's all the other things that aren't, but they often underpin lots of things that happen in the future. And if you don't keep reminding and understanding that, an awful lot of difficulty can build up. So that's what I hope I'll take. And of course, I hope I'll still be here to see a kind of a post-pandemic world.
So Rachel, do you think we'll actually hold on to that ability to bring about change quickly and empower staff? Because I think it really was very energizing for so many people.
I worry that we won't, because I suppose we've had big events in the world before. Although always when you look back at maybe how things changed, one example might be the change of the role of women after the wars, that some of it did stay. You know, some changes as a result did stay and did last. But I think we need to keep reminding ourselves. I think otherwise it's easy. Reason people fall back into ruts is because it's easy to fall back into ruts. But I'd like to think that if we could get anything big and positive out of it, is that we would learn that when we really had to, we could. So that was a nice lesson to learn. Hard way to learn it, but a nice one to learn.
Great, thanks for that, Rachel. Jennifer.
Yeah, I suppose one thing I would add to that was there was, you know, speed at which things change for the good, but also for the bad. And that's certainly what we saw in the prison, that the stripping away of rights was just as quick a response as the kind of powerful speed at which, you know, many things were improving in other sites. So there was something that was quite negative about the speed and the lack of kind of time for thinking or time for thought that came. I suppose one thing that really struck me was there was something about the universality of suffering that came about during, you know, over the last kind of year and a half. But not only has there been a kind of a universality of sadness and suffering that everyone's experienced, but it's also at the same time sort of kind of compounding of vulnerability. So for those who are less privileged, their suffering, you know, as a group has been more extreme, and that's certainly our patient group generally in mental health, and sort of specifically in parts of mental health. And I think it's something to sort of think about and wonder about, to see what we can do to maybe try and stop that from happening so extremely again in the future.
Great, thanks, thanks, Jenny. And Joanna.
Oh gosh, I feel a bit fraudulent answering this because I'm no longer on the wards. But speaking from somebody who has been on the wards and now isn't, I think the pandemic, from talking to people, especially people in publishing, is that we're now seeing more human stories of people who work within the NHS. You know, I think the number of memoirs and the number of autobiographies and stuff coming out now, and the number of stories in the media about people's lives on the wards and how they've dealt with this time, has made it a more personal thing. I think it's an excellent thing that people are now seeing kind of the human side of working on the wards and being a doctor or a nurse or whatever job you do. And it's a very positive thing, I think, and it's brought out from kind of the humorous ones from Adam Kay's book to the less humorous and the more serious, that we're now seeing kind of human side of medicine, which is never a bad thing and was missing for quite some time, I think.
So we've got, I think, 130 people who are actually watching live. There'll be many more watching later on. It's an irresistible question to ask you, Joanna. There'll be lots of people I know interested in writing, in committing their thoughts and feelings, their experiences to paper. What advice would you give to anybody that wanted to become an author, particularly coming from a health background?
Oh gosh, well, I think there's a lot of authors, a lot of psychiatrists are excellent writers, which we have seen today, and it's no surprise, because people say to me often, what are the parallels between writing and being a psychiatrist? And I say, well, it's all about story. Both sides are all about story. It's all about narrative, and it's all about picking up on things that aren't necessarily within the words. So I think as a psychiatrist you have a head start for being a writer, because you have that nailed, or else you wouldn't be doing the job that you're doing. But I think when you write anything, you've got to ask yourself, what is the point? Why am I writing this? What am I trying to say? Whether it's a short story, as we've done today, or whether it's a whole novel, you have to start off with, why am I telling this story? And write it on a post-it note and stick it above your desk and keep looking at it and remind yourself why you're telling this story and what you want somebody to take away at the end of it. And if you write with passion, it's like if you cook with kindness, it will be a good meal. If you write with passion, it will be a good book. That's my opinion. And keep going. Keep going.
Great. Well, thanks for that advice. I'm going to come to another question. I'll ask it of you first, Joanna, and that is obviously the last couple of years have been dominated by COVID, but it is our 180th anniversary. If it wasn't, if we didn't have COVID, which has been the obvious thing to write about, what would you, and I'm going to ask our other contributors, what might you have thought about writing about on the 180th anniversary of the Royal College of Psychiatrists?
Oh gosh, that's a very big question. I think it would be nice to write. It's all about voice. Writing is all about voice. And in all these winning entries, I heard the voice straight away in all of your entries. And I think it would be nice to try and write the voice of somebody who was perhaps around 180 years ago and their experiences, and try and embody that person in your writing. Try and hear their voice and put it to paper. So their thoughts and experiences are recognised too. So I think that would be a challenge, but a worthwhile one.
So perhaps your next book?
You never know. Gosh, yes. I think I perhaps need a lot of research. I'd have to talk to you guys a lot about it, but you never know. You never know what will spring from my laptop next. No.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I'll come on to Rachel. Rachel, what might you have written about if it hadn't have been COVID?
Well, I'm smiling because I was going to say I felt about 180 years old several times during this when I was struggling home at the end of the day. Well, I suppose if I hadn't been writing about the pandemic, I might have written a bit about why I ever got involved with the college, because I was thinking about that. And I do remember knowing nothing about the college, by the way, or its history or anything. And on my very first day as an SHO in psychiatry, Professor Patricia Casey was my first boss. And she had just come back from the UK to take up her professorship in Dublin. And she just said, "Are you an inceptor yet?" I had no idea what an inceptor was, but she was the professor and she was my boss. So I said, "I don't know what it is, but I'll be one by close of business." So I was, and I suppose it's funny when you're a little trainee starting off, how being part of a big organization can be really important, and all the different opportunities that were there. And I would have been involved with public education and with the training committee and various other things. So in terms of that, it's funny, you're talking about organization and history, but it's the personal stories of how people flourished or did things within the organization that interests me. And I suppose I would never tell a trainee to join it or join any college or the Irish College now just for the sake of it. It's because it's your own personal journey and your own story, and you can make so much of it. So I guess that's what I'd be doing. I'd be writing about some of the, maybe a little bit what's already been said, the personal stories of people within and how it made a difference to them, good or bad.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Jenny, what about you?
I guess it's kind of impossible in some ways to imagine what the present is not. And sort of, I suppose I kind of thought a little bit about the things that we lost this year that I might have written about, like the kind of ideas of community within mental health, kind of sort of collective organizations where people were able to come together. Sort of it felt like there was quite a lot of talk, certainly in Bristol, about sort of nature being something that was so restorative for mental health services. And it feels like something that we have lost over the last year and a half, kind of groups and community kind of things where there were a lot of people in one space. So maybe that's what I would have written about. But of course, that's with my retrospectoscope on.
Yep, who knows? Who knows? It seems to have been unbelievable to think of anything else other than COVID. So thank you for that. Lots of very positive comments in the chat, but also a reminder there's a feedback form that you can fill out on SurveyMonkey. So if you go to the chat now, there is a link that you can find. Also in the Q&A, I think really more of a suggestion from Ruby. Thank you so much, Ruby, for your contribution, just saying, well, will the next stage be reporting on how we accommodate going back or going back to a new normal? Perhaps that's a webinar or a competition for a future occasion. So thank you for that suggestion. It really only falls to me now to say a very big thank you to all of you. Thanks to our winners, Karish, Jenny, Rachel and Aliyah. Thanks to our judges, that's Rachel, Joanna, who mentioned already, Simon Rose, David Nutt and Sue Arnold. Thank you to the amazing people that are involved in our History of Psychiatry Special Interest Group. The chair, George Ikos, who I know is actually watching now, Claire Hilton, our historian in residence, to Dr. Graham Ash, who's our honorary archivist, and Mohammed Ibrahim. So thank you to all of them. Thanks to the college team that actually put these together. Dipti, Emma, Charlotte, Harry Webber, Brown, thank you all so much. Thank you to all of you for your interest and for attending. I've also had a reminder that the college keeps an archive, and all these stories, poems, contributions will go into the archive. And if anybody watching here, or you know anyone that has something which may be of sort of value to the learning about mental health, if you have something, it could be a book or it could be an artifact, please do contact the college and you can contribute to the archive. We get contributions all the time, and it's really important that we remember the history and that we reflect on it. So again, thank you to all of you for tuning in and your interest, and keep writing and get those ideas down on paper. So thank you so much, and have a good evening.